All right. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant, the Managing Director at PON, and today I have the great pleasure of being joined by Rachel Viscomi, a clinical professor of law at Harvard Law School and the director of HNMCP, the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program. Also, when I'm in the office, my floor mate, the person to whom I go to ask when my toaster oven isn't working. So a wonderful colleague all around. Rachel is going to be speaking today about facilitated dialogue, what it is, what makes it work well, and what can happen when it falls short. She'll be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. And at the conclusion of her presentation, we will open up the floor for questions from our audience. So of course, as ever, if you have a comment at any point, you're welcome to write it in the chat. And we're already seeing people letting us know where they're coming in from. So hello to you from all across the world. And then of course, if you have a question for the Q&A portion, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen so that we can more easily look through all of those questions. This talk will be recorded and posted on the PON website at the end of the week, so you will be able to review it, share it with others, or look at the slides that Rachel presents again. I'd like to give a shout out, of course, to the PON events team who does such great work in supporting these events. So Diane Long, first and foremost, our events coordinator, and also Billy Fairfield today. Thanks to them for all of their work getting us here and for everything they're going to be doing in post-production. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over the virtual Zoom floor to Rachel Viscomi. Rachel, welcome to PON Live.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And I really want to echo Nicole's thanks to all of the PON staff. And I'm so excited to get to spend this next hour with you all. And so I'm going to offer an overview of some thoughts and some reflections on facilitated dialogue. And then I'm really excited to hear your questions and to engage in some of the richness. It wouldn't feel like a worthwhile engagement around facilitated dialogue if we didn't have some dialogue. So I will look forward to that piece. But by way of gearing us up, I just want to share some insights. And what I will say is that, as Nicole shared, I'm a clinical professor, which means that I have the great joy of working with clinical students and working on clinical projects for a lot of the work that I do. And that is certainly one lens that I'm bringing to this work. I've also had the great joy of teaching, co-teaching a facilitation class, a workshop on facilitation for the last several years. That's a set of insights that I'm bringing to this work, all of the wonderful students that we've had and the learnings that have come out of that work. And I'm also, in addition to leading facilitated dialogues, I've also had the pleasure of participating in many different capacities. So I'm kind of coming at this from a lot of lenses, and I have, some insights that will come from there, and then I'm really excited to hear some of the insights that you will have as well. So with that, what I'm going to do is to go ahead and share my screen and kick us off here. So actually, it's going to take me just 1 second. What I want to start with is really this question of what do we mean by facilitated dialogue? Because I think that sometimes people have different ideas of what it is that we're talking about. And so I was having a conversation about facilitated dialogue with someone the other day who was really very focused on Twitter and on the ways that Twitter can show up, conversation on Twitter. That's actually outside the realm of what I am talking about. Sorry, my slides got a bit away from me there. For our purposes, we are really going to talk about conversations among a group of people that are happening synchronously. So at the same time, everyone in the same place or on the same Zoom screen, guided by a facilitator, right? So a facilitator is playing some role, and there is a range of roles that a facilitator might play. where we're talking about a topic that is important. And one of the things that I will say is that some dialogues are about reaching agreement, but very often they're not. And so I'm going to talk primarily about dialogues that may be about issues of public importance, maybe about topics that are important to a family, to a community, to a context, but aren't necessarily geared toward reaching agreement. So, oopsie, sorry. Okay. So, the reason to start here is that facilitated dialogue, like all processes, makes sense in some contexts and not in others. So as Nicole previewed a moment ago, I think there are contexts in which facilitated dialogue really shines. And those are ones in which complexity is important. So a lot of the dialogues that you hear people talk about are dialogues in which what they are imagining is a pro and then anti position. So people talk a lot about dialogues in the context of, abortion, and the way that they think of it is pro-choice, pro-life. And what dialogue does best is, so I would argue that there are many more sides than that. And that is where dialogue shines, is really getting beyond a false binary into a place where we can really start to understand the richness of perspectives that people are bringing, the experiences that they're bringing, the context. And so it really matters that we're able to design dialogues where we can engage with nuance. Another piece that is vital about dialogue is the reciprocity element. So dialogue has multiple components to it, and it's really important that everyone who is showing up for a dialogue is doing so open to sharing and to learning. So we'll talk in a moment about dialogues that don't work, and those can often be ones in which there is an expectation of sort of a unidirectional flow. Dialogue really requires flow in all the directions. And with that said, the third point is actually critically important, which is that it needs to be something that offers value to the participants. So there are some contexts in which folks will say, hey, I agreed to participate in this dialogue because it seemed like, you were looking for people to participate, but I feel like my role was really to educate folks who don't have as much lived experience or context or understanding about my life, my background, what my day-to-day looks like. So while that can be a really noble inclination, and certainly there are situations in which folks might want to participate in a dialogue in order to share, it's actually really important that we structure dialogue in a way that allows everyone in the room to feel like they have something to gain, something to learn, a way in which they can benefit themselves from the conversation. So there has been, there's been research, there have been evaluations done of different dialogue programs, and we'll talk about power as we move through these slides, and then I'm sure in our conversation after. And what can happen sometimes is that folks who are in and I'm going to use this as a shorthand, although I will specifically say later, I think it can be very dangerous to talk about high power and low power as if power were a unitary thing that were shifted in one direction. I think power is a lot more complicated than that. I think that can actually be quite damaging. And to use it as a shorthand in this moment, what I would say is that sometimes folks who are marginalized can feel like they participate in a dialogue. It helps expand awareness and understanding for folks who are within, dominant caste or dominant groups, so that they have a richer understanding. But at the end of the day, no action happens, and it feels not like a really worthwhile expense of their time. So what I want to do is actually have that be our shift into the question of when dialogue might not be well aligned. So I would suggest, this is a starting list, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on it. I think we should be wary of dialogue or conversations that purport to be dialogue that are actually about debate, because debate is actually something quite different. In a debate, we are often quite literally scoring points, right? We're looking to determine who has made a better point. The premise is very much that we will hold on to the views that we brought into the room with us. And in the context of dialogue, we are really looking for the opportunity for people to expand their views, to learn, to transform, to shift. And I'll hold that for a moment. We'll come back to a way in which, even though that can be a byproduct, it isn't our goal per se, but it needs to be a possibility. I need to be open to learning and not committed to defending my perspective against your perspective, as if we were doing battle. So debate, if that's what you're looking for, I would say look elsewhere. Education, going back to the last slide, while people certainly can learn an enormous amount in dialogue, I think often people think about, hey, we need to teach these people this thing. Let's have a dialogue. Let's get people in the room who can listen and learn. And that can be really risky with dialogue because of that reciprocity element. It's actually really critical that we all be engaging in a way where we have a stake. We have something to gain. We have something to share. Because that is the ground that allows us to open up enough to learn. If somebody is in sort of a one-up position and someone is in a one-down position, we're not actually anteed in the same way. We're not all taking the same risk, and we're not all holding the possibility that we'll walk away with something of value. So I would say, there may be aspects of education that are actually really important to doing dialogue well. There may be ways in which you think it's really important to do some background preparation before coming in the room to talk together. But using the time in the room in a way that is explicitly sort of, not lecture-based per se, but that is about a lopsided education, not helpful. Similarly with persuasion, if I am going in with the hope that I will, or with the expectation that I will change your mind and show you just how wrong you are, I will say probably many people go in with that expectation. But in my mind, that is a warning sign. I want folks in the room for dialogue who have something to learn, who believe that there is something to gain in engaging, and who are open to considering the ways in which their perspective might include some really important things and exclude some really important things. And so the more we can set expectations on the front end, that our process is a reciprocal process, that there's going to be give and take, the better. And the last one I put in there is organizational cover. So there are some contexts in which there will be really important moves within an organization for change, to look at certain processes. And in some contexts, folks will say like, well, let's just make people feel heard. Let's just have a dialogue. Let's kind of put a process Band-Aid on it. And in those situations, I would be wary. While it is, or maybe because it is true in the way that I think about dialogue, that often the conversation is the heart of what's happening. So you want to make sure that the conversation is important on its own terms. And if the conversation isn't the thing that is most needed, that there is a path toward what is most needed. So in that case, I would want to make sure that there was a connection between the process that's being used and the goal that we're trying to achieve. So that is, I think, a thing to ask about, particularly in a context in which you might be invited to conduct a dialogue on behalf of an organization. Okay, let's say you've decided, I've got this topic, it's great for dialogue, and I think my process is aligned, makes some good sense. Then the next question is, are you the right person to lead that dialogue? So we talk a lot about positionality. The facilitator is playing a really important role. So facilitator comes from the root to make easy, from facile to make easy. And in an ideal world, what the facilitator is doing is trying to see the dynamics of the conversation, trying to structure things in a way that allows people to engage deeply and fully about topics that are important. In a situation where the lenses that I'm bringing are missing some of what's important in the room, where my experience might be a barrier to really understanding not just what might be coming up, but how people might be experiencing what's happening. It can be risky. So I want to think not only about, I want to think about what are the specific lenses that I wear based on my own identities, based on my own experience, my professional expertise, the skill set that I have. And I also want to be wondering and actively interrogating, what are my blind spots? What are the things that I am unlikely to be attuned to? And what is the way in which I can account for those? I might do this analysis and at the end of the day say, actually, I'm not the right person. It makes more sense for someone else to lead this dialogue. And then I might think about, is there someone that I can, reach out to, that I can, try to recruit or try to connect with? I might say, actually, I think there are some really important lenses that I'm bringing, and I think it would be really amazing to have someone who brings another set of lenses so that we can kind of work together to spot the things that either one of us might miss. So even, for example, if you're working within a town, there are benefits. A lot of what we talk about in facilitated dialogue is, what are the tensions that we're managing, right? And so there are real benefits to being an insider within an organization, and there are real benefits that you bring by being an outsider, right? So how are we balancing those things? How are we not running the risk that we're standing in our own way? So let's imagine you've decided, good topic, good purpose, ready to go as a facilitator. Then the next question is, how do you reach out to folks? How do you start to learn a bit about what is important to folks who might be in the room so that you can come up with a design? And our approach is very much biased in favor of collaborative design. So how do I learn as much as I can about what's important? And then how do I make a series of choices? And you have a lot of different levers to pull. I've put just a couple of them here, and we can talk in more detail about what these might be, but what is my purpose? How do I make sure that the agenda that I design is aligned with that? That the evaluations, that the metrics that I'm using to determine whether we've been successful connect back to my purpose. How will I convene people? If I'm the one doing it, am I reaching out individually to people? Am I posting signs? Am I working my network and friends of friends to try to make sure that I have a good group? What does that look like? And then as I think about the series, one of the really critical pieces of dialogue that we'll talk about is about relationship, and how the stronger our relationship is, the more our dialogue can hold, right? The more context I have for you and who you are, the more likely when you make a comment that I have a context to put it in, and I can have a fuller understanding of what you may have meant or how you may have meant something, and lean into curiosity. So the heavier the topic, the more likely it is that I want to think about structuring actually a series that helps us continue to build those connections and deepen those connections so that we can go farther and deeper. And there are plenty of dialogues for which a one-off engagement that is, kind of an open call is perfectly fine, but you really want to be thoughtful about that on the front end. And you want to think about what is the process we're going to use. Are we going to use a circle process where we're really going around the room, we're using a talking piece? Do we want to think about something more structured, something like a story exchange? So narrative 4, for example, has a process in which they invite people to listen to and then share in the first person someone else's story. Some kind of radical perspective taking. Is this a situation where that actually might be helpful? And there are certainly some cautionary notes around that as well, but you really want to be creative around, based on my purpose, what am I trying to do? Because all of these places are places where things can go off the rails. So with a circle process, for example, there is a real structure to the way that we're moving around. And we're minimizing, in some ways, the likelihood that we're going to devolve into a lot of back and forth. That can be really helpful in many contexts, and there can be ways in which it might also feel constraining. And the question around that also has to do very much with expectations. And are we aligned around what we're expecting? Is everyone in the room on board around the way we're going to engage? And can we clarify that up front? Often facilitators will propose, what some people call them norms, some people call them guidelines. I think of them as conversational invitations. I don't want to be enforcing rules per se, but I want to invite people to keep in mind the values and that we want to hold in the way that we interact with each other. And as we mentioned, you might want to think about whether there's information that would be helpful for people to have on hand before they walk in the door. Okay. So you've got multiple levers to pull. And it's really important in thinking about which levers you pull to ensure that you are designing for equity. So what I would say in this case is, as we talked about where things can go off the rails, one of the things that is true and that I imagine all of us can call examples to mind of in this moment is the way that certain narratives, certain stories that are told are reinforced by the dominant culture in a way that makes them feel real, right? That makes them feel like they're part of the air we breathe. They're hard for us sometimes to even see as stories because they feel like representations of the world around us sometimes. And so we really want to be mindful of whose stories have the benefit of being reinforced by the culture, by society, and where will people be working against the tide to try to make the space to explain an experience that feels counter to what the default expectations might be. I'll give you a very mundane example of this. There was an article this weekend in the Boston Globe, just a little column about meant in a lovely way, but poking fun at how hard it is to be a parent of a teenager because teenagers are the worst and they don't appreciate you and all these things. And one of my teenagers was really offended at the bad rap that teenagers get and the ways in which it was such a limited perspective and so ill-attuned to the reality of what a lot of teens experience. That's an example of a counter narrative that might need more space to develop in the context of a conversation. So we really want to be thoughtful. We want to be thoughtful both about what the power dynamics may be in the room and designing a process that ensures that people feel comfortable sharing stories, but also thinking about where we might need more time and more space to develop that. This image, which some people have a strong reaction to, I love it. I first came into contact with this in a nonviolent peace force training probably 2 decades ago, but I think it came initially from Outward Bound. It's been used in a lot of contexts since then. I think it's really helpful for us to use in the context of dialogue because it helps give us a sense of the fact that this work can be hard, right? Our goal isn't to make people feel uncomfortable, but that can often be a byproduct of what we are doing in the room, which is to help people expand their perspectives. So if we're in that central green zone, the comfort zone, as you can see, we're not learning, right? We're running our automatic programs. We're maybe repeating the kinds of talking points that we are used to, the things that we're accustomed to saying when we have a conversation about this issue, and often the things about which we feel most certain. So we can have a conversation about a hot topic where we're not risking very much. And we're not risking very much, and we're not learning very much. Our goal is to really push beyond the comfort zone and to get to the interstices of our beliefs and our certainties. So to a place where we're able to say, I'm not sure what I think about this. Or, hey, you're offering this new information, and I'm trying to figure out how to metabolize that. And the work that happens in this zone requires us to be able to do something that actually is pretty complex developmentally, especially when it's a tough topic, which is for me to hold both my perspective and be able to hold your perspective, and to be curious about how they work together, about how they live alongside each other. And this is a tricky thing to do. So we want people to expect that there might be parts of our work in the room where it feels like the ground is knocked out from under your feet a little bit. And we want to make sure that we're holding the space for people to navigate that in a way where they feel supported and where they feel like they can lean in and try to open to learning. Inevitably, as you can see, we also run the risk that at any given moment, we might tip into the red zone or the panic zone, or a place in which we feel more reactive and less intentional. And by the way, these zones are fixed on this slide, but in fact, in real life, they vary depending on what the topic is, depending on what is said. There may be topics around which we actually have like quite a large learning zone, and because it doesn't feel like there's a lot at stake for us. There might be topics around which our learning zone is just a tiny little sliver, because our identity is very deeply embedded in whatever it is, and we have a lot invested in believing what we believe at the moment, because letting go of that would mean something really destabilizing for how we understand ourselves in the world. So it's really important for us to create an environment in which people are open to the fact that there may be moments where they're trying to make sense of things that aren't immediately appealing, that aren't immediately, might not seem helpful, might seem even, ill-informed or misguided, and that we're going to navigate through that together. So one of the things that we do when we tip into that red zone, as I said, we're trying to hold self and other, but when we hit into that red zone, what happens is often that the world contracts and our skills contract, and we start to run automatic patterns that are often maybe served us well in childhood, but are maladaptive for our adult selves. And depending on who we are, these might look different. So some of us will, if we're having trouble holding our perspective and a perspective of someone else in the room at the same time, we're going to really focus on our perspective. For some of us, if we're really focusing on our perspective and shutting theirs out, right? If you think about kind of our energetic boundaries, we might have a way in which we're kind of closing down the walls. We're impervious to what it is that they're offering us, right? It's bouncing off of us. when that's true, we might show up in a way that is one up, right? Like actually, you're completely wrong. I have, the answers on this issue. I know what is true and what isn't true, and you are completely misguided, right? So we might get to a place where we're sort of coming from a one-up, right? But we might also not, right? We might have a focus on self, right? We might close the walls in the same way. I need to protect myself. I need to protect my perspective, and this feels like an onslaught. But instead of showing up in kind of a self-righteous or defensive or externally focused way, we might shut down, right? Some of us might withdraw and kind of pull back from the conversation. So whereas in the one-up, you might be going more into an overuse of the giving part of dialogue or the sharing of your opinions or the advocacy piece of it. In the withdrawal side, you might be contracting in a way that pulls you back and has you do less of the sharing, right? And you may be sort of listening without taking very much in. Other people focus more on other. So if I'm trying to hold two perspectives at one time, for some of us, we will drop our own and we'll focus on the fact that the other person seems upset. It may depend on what their relationship is. But as you think about some of the research on stress responses, of course, we know fight, flight, freeze. A lot of research suggests that, and this can follow along gender lines, that tend to befriend, like how do I neutralize, how do I emotionally caretake the person in front of me in a way that may feel biologically like my best chance for navigating this situation effectively. I might engage. So that might look like that. I'm wondering, by the way, let me ask, I don't know, I'm worried that, are you guys not? Oh no, you are, okay, great. So what does that mean? How do we help people navigate some of these challenges? Well, one thing we want to do as a facilitator, and this can feel counterintuitive, but what we want to do is to actually slow things way down. Because often, if we are feeling really reactive, if we're feeling like we are under attack, regardless of what our response might be, we're being flooded with a bunch of chemicals and a bunch of hormones. And so what we want to do is to have the time to take some deep breaths and to be able to reabsorb some of that and to reground ourselves, to really come back to a place where we can be curious, where we can show up in a more thoughtful way from an intentional rather than a reactive place. So one of the things we want to do as a facilitator is actually, when we think about the questions we're designing, we want to think about hard questions. Not questions where somebody can spew out their really well-rehearsed talking points, but questions that make us think. Questions about where we're not sure. And I have a couple examples that I can offer. We also want to build in pauses, and we can do this more or less explicitly. So sometimes what we will do is to set as a rule, as a norm, an invitation. We know this is a topic that feels really high stakes, or about which people have really strong feelings. And we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to really take in what is being said and to be thoughtful about that. As opposed to feeling like they need to be figuring out what their response is and jumping in really quickly. And so sometimes what we will do is to invite people to hold silence for a certain period of time. It might be, depending on the topic, that could be a minute, could be 2 minutes, could be 30 seconds, right? All of these are some of the levers that you pull as you think about what it is that you're looking at. And you also want to think about how do you, as a facilitator, not to get away from that sort of dialogue side, how do you structure things in a way that allows people to engage with what other people have put on the table, right? Our goal isn't to come, in most cases, to a shared agreement, right? So even though this doesn't feel like it's the case in the moment, the fact that you believe something actually quite different than I believe is okay. Because we're on these separate journeys of meaning making, in which you might offer something that really actually shifts my awareness or my frame on something, where the person next to me actually, it's not new information for them, or it's not persuasive for them, or it just doesn't have an impact on the way that they view the world. But I want to be asking, if we're listening, if we're going around the circle and folks are sharing things, I want to prime people not to think about where do you agree or disagree, although those are certainly helpful things to know, but also what questions do you have? What are you hearing that's new to you? Because those kinds of questions invite people to think a little bit differently about what they're hearing. So I offer to you a visual. This was from the Bicentennial a couple of years ago. We made a little question card for folks as a giveaway, and I think some of these questions remain really worthwhile. So as you think about the kinds of questions that might be helpful, some of them have to do with where our expectations actually might be thrown, right? What would surprise people about the way that you see this issue? What are the things that have really informed your understanding about this issue? Where has your view on this issue changed over time, right? And really, really helpfully sometimes, what are the things that make it hard for you to engage? What are the things that people say that you have a really strong visceral reaction to? Because often those are things we can think about in the design. Often people will think about, are there words that we want to agree to talk our way around? Are they too hot, too triggering, where they shut us down? And we want to think about using different vocabulary. Not everyone wants to engage that way, but some groups really find that very freeing. It makes it easier for them to listen to and engage with each other. So just a couple final thoughts. So there's a poem that I love by Judy Sorum Brown called Fire. I'm not going to read it to you now, but I invite you to look it up. And the beauty of the poem is that it is talking about the ways that for a fire to burn, it needs not just the logs, not just the fuel, but also the spaces between the logs and the absence of fuel. So is there enough space? Is there enough silence? Is there enough room for everyone to feel like they can contribute? So we all have different orientations that are compounded by the other things that may be going on in a particular conversation. I know for folks who are verbal processors, for folks who are very extroverted, it can feel like, well, of course I'm going to jump in and I'm going to share my thoughts, and I expect that everyone will do the same. And for folks who are more introverted, for folks who maybe come from a more collectivist culture, from folks who are really trying to be attentive to the dynamics in the room and aren't inclined to just sort of jump in, or don't have that sense of course, everyone wants to hear what I have to say. It's really important to make sure that there are ways of structuring the dialogue that are inclusive and that allow people to really participate fully. And again, this might be a place where you think about a circle process. It'll depend a bit on the context. So coming back to a point that I made earlier, I just want to add, again, I want to lay double emphasis on the notion that the stronger our relationships are, the greater our ability is to engage thoughtfully in a way that takes us deeper. And some of that is because we have a greater ability to offer someone the benefit of the doubt. Although, of course, I think we can all, well, maybe not all, but I will say, speaking only for myself, some of my closest relationships are ones in which I might not, in the heat of the moment, give the benefit of the doubt, although certainly I would come back to it later. But the more I have a rich sense of your views and who you are as a person and what you care about and what you believe, the easier it is for me to come back to you when you say something that lands sideways for me and be curious about what you meant. Because my assumption is you, based on what I know of you, you probably were not actually meaning the worst interpretation of what you said. But the less information we have about people, the more that can be really challenging, and the more it can feel like maybe it's not safe to do that. So just a couple practice notes to end on, and then I'm excited to get to questions and conversations. Even once we've done our collaborative design, it can be really, really valuable to check in individually with folks before you do an initial convening. So that you have a sense of what are the concerns that people are bringing to the session. Are there pre-existing relationships? Are there power dynamics? Are there things that are helpful for you to be attuned to and aware of? Are there things that people are worried about coming up, or ways in which they might be more likely to shut down that they might be willing to share with you as a facilitator, but disinclined to share in the room? So any information that you're able to, open to on that front, the better. Quick return to power, I would say sometimes there can be a shorthand, like I used earlier, around high power, low power. There are all kinds of power. And there are people who might have an enormous amount of structural power, but actually not a ton of persuasive power, not a ton of moral power, not a ton of power in curiosity or integrity or different things, right? We all have different sources that we call on and that we draw on that can be helpful. And sometimes I think people can appropriately correct for having been blind to power imbalances in a way that can almost, that can do some harm, right? That can make people feel like they're being cast in a victim role, where actually they have a lot of agency and have a lot to where they want to actually not be put in a role that presumes that they need support in a particular way. I wanted to just flag as a going forward, like as things to hold in your mind as you move forward, these last 2 points that we talked about, that often we have a bias in favor of everything being equal because there is a strong assumption, at least here in the West, that equal is fair. And often that's not the case. So we want to be thoughtful about the decisions that we're making. We might land on equal time, but we want to be making an intentional decision there, as opposed to just assuming that that is the right answer in all circumstances. And as you are watching and you are thinking about this role of trying to make easy what is actually quite difficult, I think the biggest thing is to watch for balance. So how is it, are folks able individually, to both share and explore? Are they able to both take in and to offer out? Are they able to seem like they are grounded both in their own selves, but also in the conversation as it's unfolding? So I want to move us along to questions as promised. Let me stop my share. And yeah, let's have at it. Let's see what we've got.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that informative discussion. And we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to do my best to synthesize and get to as many as possible. Some of them are obviously being asked by practitioners and people who are really familiar with the field, but I'm going to start with two for people who are maybe more new to these topics. And so the first is Scott asking if you can just broadly define the difference between facilitated dialogue and mediation. And differences in goals. And then we also had a question in the chat about resources for people who are interested in learning more about facilitated dialogue, if there are any books that you would recommend or any readings.
Sure. So on the first one, I will say I have a view on this, and I will say that it's a matter of some debate. So some people would say, if you're trying to reach an agreement, that is mediation. And if you are just having a conversation in which you're not trying to reach agreement, that is facilitated dialogue. What I would say is the categories, so I would say mediation can fall within facilitated dialogue because it is a conversation in which you're engaging and you have strong feelings. So I would say it's a little bit like a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. Mediation can be a subset of facilitated dialogue, but not I wouldn't say the other way around.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And any resources, Rachel, that we should be pointing to for people who want to learn more about the topic?
It maybe depends a little bit on what the angle is that folks are looking for. A really interesting one that I love in a lot of ways, it is, so we use a lot of different readings in the course, but one that I think is really interesting for a particular look at an approach to dialogue is The Skilled Facilitator by Roger Schwartz, which is kind of an implementation of Chris Argyris's work in the dialogue realm. So it's a really interesting one, but it is definitely a subset. I think if folks are interested in engaging, there are a lot of different, so again, this is actually not a facilitated process, but like Living Room Conversations has a really rich resource online of different topics and questions that people might look to. That can be really informative. If you want to participate in a facilitated dialogue in a way that gives you some of that user experience, which I think is really helpful, and you're not adverse to talking about your own mortality, you can sign up for a death cafe online. They're held really often, and someone is leading those. I see the question around the skilled facilitator author. It's Roger Schwartz. With no T.
Great. Thank you very much, Rachel. That's wonderful and really appreciated. We have a question from Vincent, who's asking, what are some ideas for facilitators to get folks who might have maladaptive thinking to be able to participate in a group discussion rather than just kind of clam up?
Yeah, I love that question. And there are so many factors that are going to come into play, right? But one of the things that I think you can do really helpfully, it's going to depend on what the thing is that triggered the shutdown. But one thing I might do is in a low way, I might say, let's take a moment, let's take a pause, let's take a couple deep breaths. And I'm going to offer a question. I'd like to invite people a moment to jot down some thoughts on, this question. And then depending again on what's going on, you might even have people swap papers so that someone is reading a thing, but it isn't necessarily the thing that they shared. That can be a way to help someone sort of engage or reintegrate. Sometimes I might call a pause. I might check in with someone offline. I might check in with someone in the moment and say, I notice you are quiet. I'm wondering if there's something that would be helpful for us to attend to as a group. Is there something that, landed sideways? Is there something that might be helpful for us to attend to or to attune to? So there are a whole slew of things you might do, but it would really depend on what was going on. Certainly, if you knew what the source of it was, you might have a different set of approaches.
Great, thank you. And so that was maladaptive, but we have a related question about how to create space for people who are introverted and maybe sort of more reluctant. Do you have advice on how to go about making people just feel more at ease?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've found, I have one of my daughters is very introverted. And so one of the things that she's given me good feedback on is when you have a structure that gives everyone an opportunity to have a time that is their time, so that might look like we might say first, like, here's this question, I'm going to invite people to reflect on it so they feel like they can process. There's space, there's time. You might have notes. You might share the agenda in advance so that people have a chance to really process their thoughts and think about what they might like to share. But then instead of taking the first or the loudest voice or kind of letting, the sort of extroverts kind of move the direction, you might really just think about being intentional and really inviting someone. Either we'll do a go around, everyone will have a certain amount of time and we'll have a talking stick so that you know that when it's yours, it's yours to hold. Or you might check in with someone offline and say, is there a way that I can, support you or make sure that I'm making space in the conversation? Again, I think this is a place that, we're thinking about more and more in the classroom, because I think we often are less successful at this than we might like. So I'm interested in people's thoughts as well.
Well, you mentioned being in the classroom. We have a question that's around creating these discussions and leading them remotely.
Yeah.
So do you have any best practices in this strange Zoom world for how to facilitate in a remote environment?
There are some things that are fantastic about facilitating in a remote Zoom environment, and there are some things that are really challenging. I think that one of the things that is really helpful is that sometimes people actually feel more comfortable in their own space. They feel like they can decide what is around them, what their context is, and if they needed to shut it off, they could shut it off. So sometimes it can kind of increase psychological safety. Sometimes that comes at the expense of a sense of connection. So what I would say is that we want to have norms. For me, unless there is a really compelling reason, I think it's really important that everyone's camera is on. Mm-hmm. For me personally, my default would be to invite people, unless there's, and I might talk with people about this beforehand, because there are certainly reasons that this might not feel comfortable to folks, but I would invite people to leave their mics open in a way that allows us not to lose the spontaneous laughter or reaction, or because sometimes it can feel like you're talking into a void. Mm-hmm. So I think that can be helpful. It can also be really helpful sometimes to have a shared collaboration space if you want, again, to think about some of those introversion, extroversion dynamics.
Wonderful. We have a question from Stephen about when you're first meeting with parties who are going to convene, how do you determine their motivations? What are some of the questions that you might ask to understand what's bringing them here, to educate, if they want to educate or persuade, or why they've come to this discussion? Yeah,
so one of the questions that I will often ask is just, what would a good outcome look like for you? What are you hoping to walk away with at the end of this conversation? I will often ask people, what's a hope you have for the conversation? What's a fear you have for the conversation? Have you had conversations before that didn't go well? What did that look like? What is it that would make this feel like a good investment of your time? So yeah, those are some.
Wonderful. We have a question about best practices for debriefing one-off dialogues or debriefing between dialogues when there's a series. Mm-hmm. How do you go about systematically doing that in the midst of a larger process?
Yeah, great question. So I would say, at the risk of overusing, it depends. It depends. When you're thinking about what your purpose is and what your goal is for the dialogue, that's where you really want to ensure that your assessment metrics are aligned. So people have different theories of change for dialogue, and there are, I think that often students in particular will sometimes come in and say, like, we need to do a dialogue on a hard topic, and we need people to like really hear the thing that is something that they would never otherwise hear. I think that is a bias that a lot of people have in it, and it certainly can be helpful, but the foundation that you need to lay to get to the place where you can do meaningful work there is pretty significant. So if I were checking in an ongoing way in a series in that scenario, one of the things I would really want to do is to try to understand, okay, what are you feeling like you can share? Are you feeling like you're learning? Are you feeling like there are concerns that are coming up? It would, I think my questions would generally be quite open, and I would want to gauge whether people were feeling like it was a space that was moving them toward there. I will say that over the course of doing this work for a long time, I have become really enamored of dialogues. Like I talked before about ones that are outside, that don't presume a binary. Mm-hmm. Some of the best one-off conversations that we have had have been conversations about things like, what does faith mean to you? Right? What parenthood, like what has been the impact of parenthood on your life, on your views? Where has that changed? Where has that evolved? Thinking about rituals and traditions that are important to you. These are things that are actually touch on things that are quite core to how people understand themselves and their connection in the world. But they don't set off our, like, this is a place where I'm going to say something and someone is going to misinterpret it, or I run the risk of really being misunderstood. So the more people feel like they can be an authority on their experience without someone, the easier it is, I think, sometimes to build the relationship and then to move from there.
Wonderful. We're probably getting to our last question. So, but which appropriately is about time limits. So what are some best practices when you're up against a time limit, and how do you make sure to keep parties on track?
Yeah, I mean, not to undercut what I said before, I think sometimes it's helpful to just be really explicit and say, I really want to be respectful of your time. There is a lot that has been raised. If it were just a one-off, or it were our last meeting, I think what I would say is, like, we have X amount of time left. My inclination is to give each person an opportunity to just share one insight that's come out of today. How does that sound? So I would propose something efficient, but I would check in and make sure that was resonating with what the group was wanting. And wonderful. Sometimes we will use physical timers. I love a good stand timer. So sometimes we might, use that to help people guide their timing.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to try to be respectful of everyone's time here and respectful of yours, Rachel. And thank you for being so generous with your time with us in what we know is a busy season, as we're all wrapping up the end of the semester and looking forward to holidays and the new year and all of that. So thank you so much for being with us today for our last PON Live event of 2022. Thanks to all our participants. I know there were a lot of questions in the chat. We did put Rachel's contact information in case you have any further questions that we weren't able to address. We look forward to seeing our PON Live community in 2023. We're kicking off with 2 of our graduate research fellows who will be presenting their work that they've been doing in their time with PON. And we hope to see you there, or perhaps at one of our many executive education trainings that we will be running over the course of the new year. Sending our warmest wishes to all of you celebrating holidays over the next couple of weeks. Thank you, be well, and we look forward to seeing you in 2023. Thanks so much, Rachel, and to everyone here. Bye.